Just 30 years after the Wright brothers launch Aviation, a 16-year-old boy in Tennessee looks to the sky. He never turns away. His name is Bob Hoover, and his career is legendary. Hoover learned to fly when he and Aviation were both young. As a fighter pilot, test pilot, air show pilot, he was always in search of perfection. And on a day, nearly 80 years after he took his first flight, Hoover flies again over an area where he was a part of making aviation history. Bob Hoover still loves to fly. At age 91, he climbs aboard an aircraft and flies over an Air Force base where he spent an important part of his legendary career. And show pilot Randy Howell has an opportunity of a lifetime.
I can't believe I'm going to fly this Saberliner with Bob Hoover today, the man that made this jet famous almost 50 years ago.
Howell and millions of pilots around the world are inspired by Hoover's story, which begins before World War II.
How's it feeling, Bob?
Fine, thank you.
Good.
I was motivated to want to be in aviation, something I truly wanted to do more than anything else. At that young age of 16, I had to overcome the nausea from air sickness, and that was a monumental task. I was able to overcome it, and I guess that was the story of the rest of my life, my career of aviation.
In the United States, the president proclaimed a national emergency.
We immediately put a huge expansion program into operation.
I was very patriotic, and I wanted to go into combat because I wanted to do what was best for our country. But I never thought of it as a sacrifice. I thought of it as an accomplishment, an objective that I had to fulfill.
We started to train tens of thousands of pilots. And at the same time, industry was gearing up to manufacture the airplanes to arm them with.
Air power, flying machine guns, cannon, and bombs.
The storm clouds of war were building up over Europe, and so the production of airplanes went up enormously. They could see that the aviation aircraft industry were going to be capable of manufacturing airplanes in a fashion never dreamed of in our country or anywhere else for that matter.
The application of air power to give America the weapon which could engage any enemy on land, sea, and in the air.
We were told when we signed up, if you have any flying experience, don't let people in the training command know that you have some flying because they want you to learn their way. When I got to flight training, the instructor said, I'm going to take you on an orientation flight. And I said, yes, sir, as if I'd never been in an airplane in my life.
What Hoover's flight instructor doesn't know is that this 18-year-old is already a skilled aviator. They take off in a PT-17 Stearman, similar to the plane that Hoover flew as a boy. The instructor rolls the Stearman as a demonstration and asks Hoover if he wants to give it a try.
And so then I did it my way. And I pulled the nose up real steep and did a perfect roll. And he said, where did you learn to do that? And I said, I taught myself.
The instructor pilot recognizes Hoover's talent. Among the other enlisted men, he's beginning to stand out.
He went into the commandant's office and he said, I've got a problem with one of my students. And the commandant said, well, do it like we do normally, just wash him out and that'll be the end of his training. He said, you don't understand, sir. He can fly better than I can, or any instructor we've got here on the training command. I spent my whole time in primary flight training with instructors, and I was showing them aerobatics.
I think in Hoover's case, this guy comes out of high school. He has got his pilot's license already when he joins, and he is one of those natural-born pilots.
General Ronald Fogelman, retired Chief of Staff for the United States Air Force, says Hoover is among an elite group.
And yet, they have to fit within this organization, and that kind of thing is going to rise to the top.
Hoover wants to be a fighter pilot, but at 6'2", the Army Air Corps says he's too tall. They assign him to bomber training in Greenville, Mississippi. Still, he's determined to fly fighters. Hoover and a fighter pilot trainee who wants to fly bombers come up with an idea. They pay $20 to their sergeant to swap their training assignments.
And so that's how I became a fighter pilot.
Two pilots switching assignments is hardly noticed among the thousands of pilots enlisting to fight with our allies in Europe. Still, Hoover's hope to see combat isn't going well.
They sent him to North Africa, where we were shipping airplanes to North Africa disassembled. They had to be reassembled. They had to be test flown before they could be flown in combat.
So a natural pilot like Hoover, who had a great deal of innate skill, as he did so well in training and his pilot skills developed so quickly that he and others like him were able to do the test flying to make sure the airplanes were okay for the less experienced pilots.
I was flying from the first bit of daylight in the morning, stopping just long enough to stuff something into my mouth for food and some water, and getting the next airplane. And that went on day in and day out. My challenges were to be able to precisely describe what was malfunctioning or improperly operating, and making certain that corrections were made to the airplane before being declared ready for combat.
Still, Hoover wants to fly combat missions, and he finally convinces his commanders to let him go. He is assigned to the 52nd Fighter Group in Corsica. Their focus is on German supply ships crossing the Channel into France. He successfully flies 58 missions, but on his 59th, his fate changes.
February the 9th, 1944 was a gloomy day for me. I was in a flight of 4 airplanes, and our mission was to create a nuisance factor along the southern coast of France. And the targets were enemy ships that were bringing supplies down from northern Italy and the Mediterranean Sea down to the French Riviera.
Hoover is now alone and comes up against 4 German fighters. He's in a British Spitfire Mark V, the Germans in the more powerful Focke-Wulf 190.
I happened to look up in front of me and I said, "We got bogeys in the enemy aircraft at 12 o'clock high." The first 190 came in. As soon as I stated the enemy was approaching, I pickled off my external fuel tank, which did not release. And so I was just a sitting duck. I knew my mission was completed right then and there because I couldn't survive very long. The battle took place and just set up a pattern on me. And I'd look in the rearview mirror, one right after the other, and I'd see the airplane approaching. And I was shot down by one of the fighters and went in a drink. I was sitting out there in the iciest water you've ever been in. Most people think of the Mediterranean Sea as warm, but not in the wintertime. You aren't going to live all night out there if you're sitting in that cold water. And that, as the saying goes, for you, the war is over.
Hoover's fighter days are now behind him. He's picked up out of the Mediterranean by a German ship and becomes a prisoner of war, as is the case with so many pilots during World War II.
We were losing thousands of aircraft and pilots over Europe. Even if they parachuted out of a damaged airplane or were able to crash land, most were captured and put into prisoner of war camps.
When Hoover gets shot down, he's more valuable to the Germans than he is to the Americans. Because here's this guy who has all this knowledge about different airplanes and their capabilities and all that. So this is, from this perspective, this is how you look at it. I mean, I can get another guy to fly test airplanes. I got lots of them. I may not have them all with the skill that Hoover has, but my God, I've lost this guy that has all this knowledge. What's going to happen?
The prisoner pilot is transported from the coast of France and taken to Frankfurt, where he spends weeks being interrogated. He is placed in solitary confinement and put before a firing squad to try and get him to talk. But he remains silent.
And I thought, well, it's going to be over with quick. And maybe about a dozen of them, I guess, lined up to shoot you. Hell, they never planned on shooting me. They just wanted to scare the daylights out of you.
Hoover and other prisoners are shipped by rail to Stalag Luft I, a camp on the coast of the Baltic Sea in northern Germany. When he arrives, there are 1,000 prisoners. By the end of the war, more than 10,000.
We had been advised by incoming prisoners that there should be no attempts at escape the last few months of World War II, because General Eisenhower had concluded that the risks to the POWs would be greater on the countryside than it would be if they waited until they could be rescued by our own forces.
When you meet Hoover, you realize how there's probably a lot of words you could use. Stubborn might be a word, but also very persistent. And you can see that playing itself out during his prisoner of war experience.
Even in the waning days, I mean, there were lots of guys who said, hey, this thing's over. I'm going to sit here and wait till the Americans come and get me out of this thing and take me back to civilization. But not Bob, you know, he's plotting this thing.
Hoover is a POW for a year and a half and attempts many escapes. 2 weeks prior to the end of the war, he tries again. This time, he and 2 other prisoners make it past the guards, their dogs, and the barbed wire fence. Hoover and fellow prisoner Jerry Innes look for a way out of Germany. They hide in an abandoned barn for a few days, and later end up at a farm where they find a handgun. They find an airfield with several battle-damaged planes hiding under camouflage. Hoover discovers a Focke-Wulf 190 with fuel that he hopes will fly. Ennis holds a mechanic at gunpoint to start the engine, but he won't get into another airplane. So Hoover flies alone.
I didn't want to take a chance on coming out of that revetment and having somebody start shooting at me. And so I just stayed right in the revetment. And when I got it up to full power, I released the brakes, and it went straight out of there, just went out across the grass, got airborne, got the gear up, and I suddenly realized that I was absolutely the dumbest idiot that ever flew an airplane. I'm in an airplane with swastikas and no parachute, and a perfect target for some second lieutenant right out of flight training, and no way of defending myself or wanting to if it was a friendly airplane. Because of an overcast above, I decided I would go up and fly just underneath the overcast. And then if an American airplane came along, I could duck into the clouds and they couldn't see me, and I could survive that way.
Hoover doesn't have any navigational equipment, but he knows that if he flies northwest, he'll find Allied territory. He sees windmills. He's out of Germany.
So he crash-landed in a farmer's field in Holland, knowing that he couldn't try to land on one of our bases and be shot down. So he landed in his field and then had to do some smooth talking to convince the farmers that came out to see what had just landed in their field and who this German pilot was. I don't know if it was his winning Tennessee personality, but he was able to persuade them that he was an escaped American prisoner, and they were able to return him to an Allied base.
VJ Day. The Second World War at last is over.
After 2.5 years overseas, Hoover heads for home. He brings with him experience and leadership skills that launch his future.
When I returned from my time overseas, I received a phone call from my former commanding officer at the time I was shot down, Marvin McNichol, and he had always told me that if I survived the war, he would get me an assignment to Wright Field. And he knew that I wanted to be a bona fide test pilot, and it was a very hard thing to get into.
Of the tens of thousands of pilots that were trained in the war, only a handful became test pilots. They were all hand-selected, and they were picked because of their innate or basic flying ability. They were called good stick and rudder men at the time. So they could fly well, but it was more than that.
Hoover's experience becomes even more important as the Air Force moves into high-speed jets. There's a smaller margin of error for the experimental test pilots who fly them. The Army sends Hoover to Muroc Airfield in California, later Edwards Air Force Base, where he works on the X-1 program with fellow test pilot Chuck Yeager. The experimental X-1 is the plane that breaks the sound barrier. Within a couple of years, Hoover becomes a civilian test pilot for North American Aviation.
The major portion of our test flying was accomplished right here at LAX. But when we got to the real high-risk stuff, if we knew it was high risk, we'd go to Muroc. So we'd have that big lake bed of 11 miles for recovery, and the airplane was crippled. We wanted to save the airplane to see if we could salvage whatever we could knowledge-wise because of whatever failure might have taken place.
After the war, aviation fuels a large part of the U.S. economy. This means Hoover's a hot commodity as a civilian test pilot, but it's a high-risk job.
One of the motivations that one has once you get exposed to going into battle is, how will I conduct myself? How am I going to be strong enough to know what to do right and not panic and not be scared? It set up an attitude, a frame of mind, if you will. It was a different way to live for you. Every day, you didn't really know what was going to happen. You'd watch people decimated around you, and you'd think, well, it can't happen to me. Having lived through all of that, I have to tell you that you end up with an attitude that shapes your entire thinking. And it was that way for the rest of my life, and has been.
Yeah, we'll start slowing to 200.
The jet age is in full swing by the early 1950s. Test pilots put themselves into extraordinary situations to prove that new supersonic aircraft perform to specifications, but there are a large number of crashes and fatalities. They don't have simulators to test theories. They have to push these jets to their design limits and interpret every detail about their performance. It's part of Hoover's legacy. In 2013, Bob Hoover returns to Edwards Air Force Base, where decades earlier, he tested a strategic fighter for North American Aviation, the F-86.
The old familiar lake bed.
Yeah.
The F-86 was very important to the Air Force. It was jet-powered, swept-wing, higher-speed aircraft, and it was really the product of the testing that was happening at Edwards.
Hoover tests a fly-by-wire system, which automates some of the aircraft controls in the F-86. This flight nearly cost him his life.
I released my brakes from takeoff, and just another routine flight from my viewpoint. As soon as I got off the ground, I hit the landing gear handle, which is on the forward left-hand instrument panel, and it was shorted out. When the landing gear came in the up position, and that's where my terror took place, was immediately after takeoff. And I was out of control for well over 35 minutes. And I was headed in the opposite direction from my takeoff And it appeared that I was going to crash right into the numbers at the end of the runway. I really didn't think I was going to survive. And without any control at all, the airplane just automatically, because the tail was free floating, it just pulled out of the dive, and the stick was solid. I couldn't move it.
As the F-86 recovers, Hoover uses a combination of throttle, speed brakes, and flaps to regain control. His problems continue, though. Rip Hewitt, a fellow test pilot, sees Hoover narrowly escape catastrophe.
He came down over what used to be called the Pan American hangar. I reckon Bob cleared that hangar by about 20 feet.
He then heads out over the ocean. Chase pilots tell him to eject, but he has a bigger concern.
We had 6,000 airplanes under contract that would have this control system in it if it worked. And this was the prototype to prove that it did work. And if I lost the airplane, we'd never know exactly what went wrong. I got this equilibrium set up, established a rate of climb, and I thought if I can get it up high enough, I can make it to the desert and try and save the airplane by landing it on the dry lake bed.
As he climbs over the mountains, the F-86 oscillates in the high winds again. He uses the same approach as before and regains control.
And I was 35 miles out from the dry lake bed at Muroc. And I set up the approach, and each of my chase pilots said, this is your last chance to get out. You better do it while you can. They kept encouraging me to eject, and I chose not to.
Now he's faced with landing this damaged jet at nearly 300 miles an hour. His chase pilot, Joe Lynch, reminds him that the landing gear isn't designed for the speed. Hoover acknowledges this, but as he has done countless times before, he calculates the risk and commits to landing.
As I got down to the edge of the lake bed, I kept waiting for the bad things to happen, and suddenly I tell the wheels were on the lake bed, but I couldn't feel it. I mean, it was just like landing on a wet runway. And I chopped the throttle as soon as the wheels touched, and just held it off and used the speed brakes.
And you said you rolled for
11 miles.
11 miles.
Yeah. It's 11 miles from here to the other side of the lake bed there. This lake bed has saved more lives than most people would ever think about. I've landed here under all kinds of circumstances with control problems that I would never have survived landing anywhere else.
And on the other side of the lake bed, Hoover meets a new generation of test pilots.
A lot of the people in the flight test community have a great appreciation of those people who came in front of us doing work back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was a very difficult time.
To have Bob over here was awesome because he has great ties with the Edwards Air Force Base and everything that he has tested. Trying to follow in those footsteps is a huge task to even fathom. Be able to fly in a sim with them, be able to talk with them, be able to interact with them, and just hear some of the stories from his days here at Edwards and what he was doing with tests is just an amazing experience.
Could you level off at 2,000 feet above the water for me?
2,000 above the water?
Uh-huh.
I've always read about classic aircraft and dogfights and things like that growing up, but then to actually meet the guys who participated in these events, not just the aircraft involved, but the actual personal stories, it was a great privilege.
If you stay within the design limits of the airplane, you can do a whale of a lot of great things with a little airplane object. The young test pilots are far more prepared to do any kind of testing that comes along, more so than we ever were, because so much knowledge has been evolved from the years that intervened here.
To these young test pilots, Bob Hoover and his colleagues represent the legacy of the golden age of test flight.
My hat's off to them. I'm very proud of them for choosing that profession.
So
what the altitude was of Edwards?
2,300 feet.
23?
I don't think I'm any different than any of the rest of the pilots that perform before the public. My interest is in showing them entertainment, showing them what an airplane can do if properly flown.
I'd like to be about 30 feet right across the edge of this roughness here.
I remember a lot of people seeing me do a roll on takeoff with the Saberliner, and they said, my God, I figured it was dead. I figured this guy didn't know what the hell he's doing. And yet you just flew away like it was nothing. You'd gotten to the end of the runway and you were upside down. It was fun.
And you see the old base, okay? We're coming in straight to that runway, the other side of the lake bed.
Bob Hoover takes his expertise to the public stage, flying air shows. His aerobatics are entertaining, but even more, he inspires professionalism among pilots. They watch him use conventional aircraft like North American's T-39 Saberliner to do unconventional maneuvers.
I chose it because I wanted to demonstrate its magnificent flight qualities and capability to those would-be purchasers, because they would never have seen anybody else's business jet airplane doing those kind of maneuvers.
We're now inside the cockpit of the Saberliner, which is an executive-type transport aircraft. Bob will put the aircraft through a series of aerobatic maneuvers.
It's extremely important to have him take your product into the sky, where everyone's watching, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and just show what this airplane can do.
Bob will again be performing point rolls, loops, Cubans.
This becomes obvious when North American Aviation merges with Rockwell International. They have a corporate plane, a slow seller, the Shrike Aero Commander. This changes when Hoover flies it at the air shows.
It's the first time I flew for the public. We got 3 orders. And then thereafter, everywhere I went, they wanted to buy the airplane that I was flying. So we sold them by the hotcakes, and they went from $85,000 without a change to $295,000. It gave people confidence in the airplane. They think, if it will do that, it must be a real strong airplane.
Industry can go to the bank with Hoover's name because of his precision as an aviator. Rockwell recognizes his contributions and elevates him to corporate vice president. Later, he becomes an entrepreneur and develops his own successful businesses. He's an executive, still flying air shows.
Here we see Bob coming in to do one of the most spectacular maneuvers that we do in any of the aircraft that Bob uses in the air show circuit.
Hoover demonstrates a maneuver he's famous for. The audience goes quiet. He gets the Shrike Commander up to speed and shuts both engines off, a nightmare scenario for most pilots. He pulls the nose up and performs his routine. Hoover reminds himself before each flight that this is a move that cannot tolerate the slightest error in judgment. It's a crowd thriller.
Air shows are basically an inspiration. Everyone remembers as a youngster going to an air show, and they carry that throughout their life, whether they go into aviation or not.
Ladies and gentlemen from Los Angeles, California.
I just remembered what an impression it made upon me the day I met Roscoe Turner. Roscoe Turner was a famous race pilot long before World War II, back in the 30s. He wore boots, riding breeches, and a Sam Brown belt, uniform, and a hat. And I picked up a mechanic's cloth and I started cleaning his windshield. And he said, "Well, I sure thank you, young man. That's very nice of you. Why don't you get in that cockpit and sit down and see how it feels to you?" And I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. This is Roscoe Turner. He was an inspiration to me. I just thought, there's a guy that got me so excited about flying, more than I was already. And I've tried in a small way to be nice to kids. I have had young people who became leaders of the Blue Angels and of the Thunderbirds who were 14-year-old kids that came up to me, and I put them in the cockpit, remembering what an influence it had made upon me. And that's very rewarding.
The first air show where I saw Bob perform was a smaller airport, a county airport, probably fewer than 50,000 people, I would say. Other shows that I attended later on with Bob ranged up to hundreds of thousands of people. Bob approached the air show business the same, whether it was 50,000 or 500,000 people. It was attention to detail and precision and reliability.
Major General Scott Hansen is Director of Operations Air Mobility Command at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. He's 24 years old when he attends his first air show and meets Bob Hoover.
I was just learning how to fly an airplane when I saw air show performers take airplanes and do things with them I'd never seen before. In particular, when I watched Bob Hoover's routine and the narration that went along with it with Jimmy Driscoll, it was like a symphony. The maneuvers that Bob Hoover became famous for in the air show business were things I saw for the very first time that weekend.
This youngster by the name of Scott Hansen became friendly with Jim Driscoll, and he was expressed an interest in flying, and he hung around the airplane wanting to assist Jim. But every weekend I'd be visiting with him and giving him encouragement, and that's how that relationship started.
Then Hoover invites Hansen to take a ride in his Shrike Commander.
The whole notion of shutting down engines, rolling the airplane, energy conservation, dead stick landing, I saw it all front and center, riding in the airplane along with Bob. It was amazing.
Hansen joins the Air Force after working a summer with Hoover at air shows. He served for more than 30 years and continues to fly.
I think back to the things I've had the opportunity to do and the things I've seen. I've traveled all around the world. I think I've been in about 60 different countries, flown airplanes into most of them myself. Throughout the years, I think some of the same values that I saw exhibited in Bob Hoover are the same things that helped me in any successes that I've enjoyed.
Now, that's really a success story that makes you proud that you influenced somebody who could take all of those steps and get to where he is. Thinking out of the box means pulling that vision out of thin air that might be a loophole of capability for saving the airplane and perhaps, of course, your life. And if you don't have some avenue of opportunity that you can call upon within your mental processes, you can be in deep trouble very quick. The decision has to be bang, and sometimes it's a split-second decision. You're faced with it, and you've got to act. And if you don't, it's going to be over with anyway.
Precision defines the gentleman pilot from Tennessee. Among the many aircraft he flies is a yellow P-51 Mustang, the pride of World War II, Old Yellow.
I chose the P-51 for the air shows because it was such a delightful airplane to fly. It had great performance, and I could do all of the maneuvers I wanted to do with it and felt comfortable about it.
By the time Bob was flying the P-51, which was legendary, and people just enjoy seeing the Mustang and hearing it at air shows. And he could really perform in that aircraft.
The P-51 had a great reputation. It probably shot down more airplanes against our enemies than any other. If not, it was very close to the top. For the public, it was an airplane that looked good, and it had a nice sound to it, that Rolls-Royce engine.
Hoover has more than 30,000 hours of flight experience in more than 300 aircraft, handling high-risk problems. Thousands of people see this firsthand at Transpo 72, an air show outside of Washington, D.C.
They're the biggest event ever of its type in our country. And I had a gear failure was unable to get it to extend on one side. So I landed on one wheel trying to balance it in hopes that I could shake the gear loose that was trapped in the wheel well. You can see we had the runway covered with foam to try and keep the airplane from leaving the runway. And you know, it's a strange thing. All the many different types of airplanes I've flown, they can be unforgiving, and if you've got to anticipate the worst possible situation and give thought to it.
How did you feel just as you were coming down?
Well, very disappointed. That's a beautiful airplane and one that's just been rebuilt, and it's always sad to scratch an airplane.
How about scratching you? Were you concerned for yourself?
No, no concern there at all.
I'm a pretty darn good stunt flyer, pretty darn good air show pilot, but I'm no Bob Hoover.
Sean D. Tucker flies for Team Oracle. He's a legendary aerobatic pilot who's been performing at air shows since the 1970s.
Bob Hoover has touched my life and empowered me to reach my full potential. And I feel so strongly that he has done that through his entire career. I was in Redmond, Oregon, and that was the farthest place I've ever been to fly a show from California, and I'm all by myself, and there's Bob Hoover in his car reading the Wall Street Journal. And I knock on his window, and he rolls it out. Yes, Mr. Hoover, I'm Sean Tucker, and I'm flying the show with you. He stopped everything, got out of the car, and he says, well, welcome aboard. From there, our friendship developed. He took an interest in me as a human being. He took an interest in me as a pilot, as an aviator. He watched me fly, and he would critique my flight every single time.
He has more charisma than any aviator I've ever known in my life. And I am so proud to know him.
Without Bob Hoover's mentorship, without Bob Hoover's friendship, I probably wouldn't be alive today, and I certainly would not be the person I am today.
I was at the Salinas Air Show, and it was Sean's turn to perform. He had a ribbon cut that he would have 3 ribbons. He would come in on what is a knife and edge. You'd take it up, put it on its side, and he would cut the first ribbon with one wingtip down, and then he would go to the middle ribbon and dive down and cut that ribbon while inverted, and then come up on the other side and cut the third ribbon with the other wing. I had been watching him, and I had been concerned, so I got a fellow to take his camera and get a photo of the whole thing, which he did. I went over to his hangar with him afterwards to have a glass of wine.
He says, Sean, you're a magnificent flyer, but you're making big mistakes flying that low every single time, because eventually you're gonna have a bad day. And when you do, you're gonna die. And so I suggest that you move the ribbons up, because the people don't know the difference. And I did.
And so he started doing that, and of course, it looked so much better and was smoother. But the important thing to me was it was making him a lot more safe. And I was mostly worried about keeping Sean and all the rest of the folks that were younger than me on the airshow circuit alive.
Throughout his career, Bob Hoover sets and resets the bar for precision. Everything he does is for the love of flying.
we're high enough to your viewpoint, and in an area where I can do it, I'll put up and do a roll, and I'll know whether I've got it or not.
Okay. I would like to see you do a 4-point roll.
That's what I want to do. I'm going up real steep.
At nearly 92 years old, this flight in a Saberliner is more than a chance to revisit his past. It's a flight to prove to himself that he still has the right stuff.
Okay, you've got it. That was nice, Bob.
Yeah, he still got it.
Yeah, he does. He's still got it for sure.
Flying with Bob in the Saberliner was very important to me. He's done such great things for our country. He's an aviation legend, especially in the airshow world. How often is it that you get to work with a man that inspires you to be great?
He's completed his journey. He never weakened on his conviction for excellence, and he's always been a good example to people in the aviation communities. He's always held himself to a very high standard, and I feel that Bob, when he looks himself in the mirror, he has a big old smile on his face and said, all right, I did my job.
I think the future's great for young people. It's true they don't have the knowledge of history that they've lived through, but they've seen these enormous, gigantic changes as we've moved along in time.
Bob's got the airplane.
It's just amazing to me, the development that has occurred, and we're still on the threshold of where we will be another 50 or 100 years from now. I think that the future's even more bright now as we gain more knowledge, technology-wise. It opens up other opportunities of experiment and knowledge that hasn't been available to us before.
From his boyhood dream of becoming an aviator, and through the decades since, R.A. Bob Hoover found and lived perfection in flight.